This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you want to pre-order Wilds of Eldraine, you can use my link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Hone, and it's time for another Wilds of Eldraine set review video. So far I've looked at every multicolored, colorless, white, blue, and black card, and today we're looking at red. For each of these cards, I'll discuss how I think it'll play in Limited, and I'll sum up my thoughts by using a letter grade. If you're new to my set reviews, you can find out what my grades mean by looking in the description. A couple of things to keep in mind as we look at these cards. I'm only evaluating them for play in Limited and not in any other formats. That also means we're only talking about cards that appear in draft boosters. These are also my evaluations of these cards before playing with them, so I'm of course not going to be right about everything. As I play more of the format, I'll be providing updates about it here on the channel. I also want to let you know that I'm offering some set review related perks for both patrons and channel members. You get access to my ongoing notes during preview season, and by the end of the set review, you also get a spreadsheet with all of my grades. If those perks sound interesting to you and you want to support the channel, you can find ways to become a channel member or a patron in the description. Alright, without further ado, let's look at the first red card in my Wilds of Eldraine limited set review. We're starting with Belligerent of the Ball, which for 2 generic and a red is a 3/3 Ogre Warrior at uncommon. It has Celebration. At the beginning of combat on your turn, 2 or more non-land permanents enter the battlefield under your control this turn. Target creature you control gets +1/+0 and gains Menace until end of turn. This has solid base stats, and on turns where you get Celebration going, it's going to make one of your attackers significantly more problematic. Importantly, it can target itself. Also importantly, the format has lots of different ways to trigger Celebration. There's lots of permanents that create tokens when they enter the battlefield and things like that. You're not going to be triggering Celebration every turn, but with an ability like this, even if you only trigger it once or twice, it's going to deliver significant value, especially because the baseline's fine, giving this a C+. Next up, it's Bellowing Bruiser, which for 4 generic and a red is a common 4/4 haste. It has an adventure called Beat a Path, which for 2 generic and a red is a sorcery. It says up to 2 target creatures can't block this turn. So if a creature has an adventure, that means you can cast it as that spell, and then after that spell resolves, it gets exiled, and then you can cast that creature from exile. Keep in mind, you don't have to cast the adventure before casting the creature, but if you cast the creature before casting the adventure, you don't get to cast the adventure. I'm pretty high on adventure creatures in this set, especially because last time they were so amazing, but this one doesn't seem quite as good as most of the others. This is because it doesn't really generate a 2-for-1 or anything even close to one. It isn't bad by any means, but the adventure side is a highly situational card. It can be powerful in the right spot, and if you ever have 8 mana to cast both halves, that's not a bad late game top deck. But overall, I don't see Beat a Path being that impressive, and the same is true of a 5 mana 4/4 haste. It's still a solid card that'll make the cut a decent chunk of the time, but I also think you'll end up not playing it a decent chunk of the time too. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Bespoke Battle Garb, which for 1 generic and a red is a common artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +2/+0. It has Celebration. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if 2 or more non-land permanents enter the battlefield under your control this turn, attach Bespoke Battle Garb to up to 1 target creature you control, and it can equip for 2 generic. This looks pretty awful to me. 2 mana to play and 2 to equip for +2/+0 just isn't where you want to be, or even close. The Celebration trigger on it will let you equip it for free sometimes, but even when that's the case, I'm not that interested. Maybe it could be useful for putting on rats or other tokens, but it's so inefficient and clunky that you're probably better off just not playing it and playing a card that has a bigger impact on the board, like any random 2 mana 2/2. Giving this an F. Next up, it's Boundary Lands Ranger, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 human ranger at uncommon. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, you may discard a card. If you do, draw a card. This has passable base stats, and if you can get it to rummage every turn, it will feel pretty impressive. A 2 mana 2/2 that just gave you the option of rummaging every combat would be quite good. That's great card selection that can really turn a game around for you. Obviously, this doesn't quite get there. You're not always going to be able to make it do this thing, and that's especially true on the first few turns of the game. And even just sticking a big creature in play is far from guaranteed, so I think it's just a C. Next up, it's Charming Scoundrel, which for 1 generic and a red is a 1/1 human rogue at rare with haste. When it enters a battlefield, you have 3 options. You can discard a card and then draw a card, you can make a treasure token, or create a Wicked Roll token attached to target creature you control. Roll tokens are a new thing in this set. They are aura tokens. This particular one gives a creature +1/+1, And when the aura goes to the graveyard, your opponent loses 1 life. So this is really good. The option that'll be the most consistently powerful is the Wicked Roll token. On its own, that means you get a 2-mana 2/2 with haste and upside. The other 2 options are where you'll go later in the game when getting a Wicked Roll token isn't exactly going to change things for you. It is nice it can put it on other creatures. So that mode will be useful more often than just like on turn 2 when you play Charming Scoundrel. I think this is a B. Next up, it's Cut In, which for 3 generic and a red is a common sorcery. It deals 4 damage to target creature. Create a young hero roll token attached up to 1 target creature you control. This roll token makes it so that when the creature attacks, if its toughness is 3 or less, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. 4 mana, deal 4, sorcery speed definitely isn't premium, and I don't think adding a young hero roll token to the mix gets it there either. Still, it can kill a decent number of things, and it does add to the board a little bit too. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Edgewall Pack, which for 3 generic and a red is a 3/3 common dog. It's got Menace, and when it enters a battlefield, you make a 1/1 black rat creature token with this creature can't block. A 4 mana 3/3 Menace that makes a 1/1 that can't block is pretty nice, probably in any format, but it's worth noting that this triggers cards with Celebration on its own, and there are even some rat payoffs in the format. If you can play like a turn 2 thing with Celebration, a turn 3 creature with Celebration, and this on turn 4, that's going to be a pretty frightening curve out. This seems pretty good overall for a common. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Embereth Veteran, which for 1 red is a 2/1 Human Knighted uncommon. You can pay 1 and sacrifice it to create a young hero roll token attached to another target creature. A 1 mana 2/1 can get in for some decent damage if you play it on turn 1, but tends to become irrelevant fairly quickly. This helps overcome that by letting you put a young hero roll on something, and while it's not the most amazing of the rolls, since it requires a creature to be small to get a buff from it, and the creature also has to attack to get things going, it does mean the veteran can significantly augment your creatures in some situations. If you have 2 mana around when you play this, it's something else that can trigger Celebration all on its own. I think this is a C+. Next up, it's Flick a Coin, which for 2 generic and a red is a common instant. It deals 1 damage to any target and you create a treasure and you draw a card. Each thing this does individually is unimpressive, but getting them all for 3 mana seems like a decent enough deal, especially if you're in the market for fixing. If you can kill an X1 with this, as long as that creature isn't a token, you're going to feel like you're getting some serious value. There is also a spell deck in this format, and anytime that's true, any spell that can replace itself gets a little bit of a bump. I think this is a C. Next up, it's Food Fight, which for 1 generic and a red is a rare enchantment. Artifacts you control have 2 generic. Sacrifice this artifact. It deals damage to any target equal to 1, plus the number of permanents named Food Fight you control. So this lets you sacrifice your artifacts to do 2 damage with them, basically. That's not bad, provided you have the artifacts. Obviously, the big joke is to do it with food tokens, which will really feel like a food fight, but it isn't like there's a critical mass of food in red. Instead, you're more likely to use treasure. I think this probably needs a build-around grade because I think your typical red deck in this format just won't have enough artifacts for this to really be worth it. If you end up with a bunch of them, I can see Food Fight working out. It's probably an F, though, in your typical deck, red deck in the format, and a C+ if you have a high enough artifact count. Next up, it's Frantic Firebolt, which for 2 generic and a red is a common instant. It deals X damage to target creature where X is 2, plus the number of cards in your graveyard that are instant cards, sorcery cards, and or have an adventure. The base form of this card is bad. 3 mana to do 2 just isn't good, but upgrading this so it just does 1 more damage already has you at premium removal, and that's not a huge ask, especially in red decks in the format. And that also means it has a pretty impressive ceiling. Basically, this has that bad floor, but it will also never be that bad. And I definitely think that means this does enough to be premium removal. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Gnawing Crescendo, which for 2 generic and a red is a common instant. Creatures you control get +2/+0 until end of turn. Whenever a non-token creature you control dies this turn, create a 1/1 black rat creature token with this creature can't block. These effects don't usually pan out well in Limited. Every now and then we actually have like an aggressive red deck that can cast a go-wide spell and win games quickly. And it does look like both red-white and black-red are capable of that, but it's still so situational. It's nice that you get something, even if your creatures die, but the 1/1s that can't block aren't exactly going to help you on the backswing. So this probably is another card that needs a build around. It's probably a D in your typical red deck in the format, but if you really get there on going wide, it's more like a C. Next up, it's Godric Cloaked Reveler, which for 1 generic and 2 red is a 3/3 legendary human noble at rare. It's got haste, it has celebration. As long as 2 or more non-land permanents enter the battlefield under your control this turn, Godric Cloaked Reveler is a dragon with base power and toughness 4/4 flying, and 1 red. Dragons you control get +1/+0 until end of turn. A 3-mana 3/3 with haste is a card you always play in Limited, so the fact that this has this sweet celebration trigger is big upside on an already pretty good card. One cool thing about him is that you can play him and then another permanent that turn to have him do the dragon thing right away. That isn't always going to happen, but this is another one of these celebration cards where even if you just trigger it once or twice, it's going to make a massive difference in the game, especially because the baseline's so good. I'm giving this a B+. Next up, it's Crabby Giant, which for 3 generic and a red is a 4/3 giant at common. It has reach, and you can pay 2 generic and a red and sack an artifact or land to draw a card. And it has an adventure called That's Mine, which for 1 generic and a red is an instant, and it creates a treasure token. This offers you some decent ramp early and a mediocre body with an expensive activated ability later. Notably, he can ramp into himself, so like if you cast the adventure at the end of your opponent's turn and then play him on turn 3, you know, that does sort of make the card work all on its own. Generally speaking, though, you probably would rather have played like a 2-drop on turn 2 than That's Mine, but it does mean like if you don't have a 2-drop, you can kind of make this hand work okay. He's never going to have a huge impact on a game or anything like that, but he's reasonable, he offers significant value. I'm giving him a C. Next up, it's Grand Ball Guest, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 human peasant at common with Celebration. It gets +1/+1 and has Trample as long as 2 or more non-land permanents enter the battlefield under your control this turn. A vanilla 2-mana 2/2 is a D these days, and while I think triggering Celebration is doable, it isn't going to happen so much that this will be a 3/3 Trampler every turn or anything, and it isn't even like a 3/3 Trampler is relevant all game long. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Harried Spear Guard, which for 1 red is a 1/1 human soldier at common. It has haste. When it dies, you make a 1/1 black rat creature token with this creature can't block. This isn't bad in terms of sacrifice fodder, as it gives you 2 bodies for the price of 1. It will quickly get outclassed in most games and be relegated into chump block mode. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Hearth Elemental, which for 5 generic and a red is a 4/5 elemental at uncommon. It costs X less to cast, where X is the number of cards in your graveyard that are instant cards, sorcery cards, and or have an adventure. And it has Stoke Genius as an adventure, which for 1 generic and a red is a sorcery. You discard your hand and draw 2. The adventure side here is the kind of thing that you're usually only going to use in the later stage of the game when it allows you to reload your hand and you don't really have to discard anything. It's not a great idea to use it when you have a bunch of cards, so this isn't an adventure where you're always going to want to cast the adventure side before you cast the creature. Sure, you can make the elemental easier to cast if you decide to force yourself to discard some real cards, but I don't think you should give up those real cards just to make this vanilla 4/5 cheaper. But overall, we're looking at a card that I think is pretty powerful. It won't be that hard to reduce its cost to something like 4, and if you just hold on to it for a while and then cast Stoke Genius later in the game and then play Hearth Elemental later in the game, I mean, that's going to be a pretty powerful late game turn that is very doable. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Imidane the Pyro Hammer, which for 2 generic and 2 red is a 4/4 human knight at rare. Whenever an instant or sorcery spell you controls that targets only a single creature deals damage to that creature, Imidane deals that much damage to each opponent. This has solid stats, and red has enough commons and uncommons that target things for the ability to do its thing sometimes, and when she can, she's going to be a pretty big pain for your opponent. Still, she's going to be a 4-mana 4/4 a big chunk of the time, and while that's fine, certainly not anything exciting, giving her a C+. Next up, it's Kindled Heroism, which for 1 red mana is a common instant. Target creature gets +1/+0 and gains first strike until end of turn. Scry 1. We've seen this trick many times before, and it's always fine. The boost can allow your creature to win a decent number of combats, and when you can make that happen for only 1 mana, it feels amazing. It isn't a combat trick that's useful against removal, and really like the best combat tricks, the ones you want to run the most, are good in combat and against removal. This really only checks one of those boxes, and it isn't even always that good in combat if your creature's too outclassed. I'm giving this a C-. Next up, it's Corvold and the Noble Thief, which for 3 generic and a red is an uncommon enchantment saga. It enters the battlefield with a lore counter, and you get a Chapter 1 effect, and then on each of your subsequent draw steps, it gets another lore counter, and you get the next effect after the final chapter triggers. You sacrifice it. Chapter 1 and 2 give you treasures. Chapter 3 exiles the top 3 cards of target opponent's library, and you can play those cards this turn. The turn you play this, it's going to feel really bad, because paying 4 and not getting anything meaningful on the board is not ideal in Limited, especially because the next chapter does the same thing. Now, this can potentially ramp you all the way to 7 mana for your next turn, assuming you also had a land to play. And that's cool if you have something to play. But the chapter where you really get some real value is chapter 3, because it allows you to potentially draw 3 cards, and you can use the treasure that this produced to help you cast those cards, because this doesn't have one of those clauses where you can spend mana as though it were mana of any color. You have to have these treasure to make it work. You also have to hope you hit, not 2 lands and some mediocre card, which is definitely something that can happen. Overall, I mean, this has power, but it's so slow. It doesn't really add to the board, and it takes too long to deliver any value for it to be good. I mean, if this format ends up being really slow, this could be a pretty powerful card, just because it does eventually give you so much for the card that you use up. But it's pretty unusual to have a format where you can play things that cost 4 and don't add to the board at all forever. So I'm not very high on this. I'm giving it a D. Next up, it's Merry Bards, which for 2 generic and a red is a 3/2 human bard at common. When it enters the battlefield, you can pay 1 generic, and when you do, you create a young hero role token attached to target creature you control. So you can kind of play this as a 4-mana 3/2 with a roll token, which means it'll be a 4/3 the next time it attacks, and then a 5/4. That's not a terrible investment, and the fact you can put the token somewhere else, like on something that can attack right away, really matters. Just playing this as a vanilla creature is a lot less appealing, but that's really the fail case. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Minecart Daredevil, which for 2 generic and a red is a 4/2 Dwarf Knight at common. It comes with an instant adventure called Ride the Rails, which costs 1 generic and a red. Target creature gets +2/+1 until end of turn. I like this a lot. It resembles some of the adventures from original Eldraine that were huge overperformers. Yes, you've got a mediocre trick on one side and a mediocre vanilla creature on the other, but you get both on one card, and both halves of this card can conceivably trade with something, and that means you're getting a 2-for-1 out of your common. This is going to be one of Red's better commons. I'm giving it a C+. It wouldn't be crazy to me if it ended up being a B-. Next up, it's Monstrous Rage, which for 1 red mana is an uncommon instant. Target creature gets +2/+0 until end of turn. Create a monster roll token attached to it. That roll token gives +1/+1 and trample. So we've seen 1 mana for +3/+1 and trample before, and it usually makes for a nice trick for aggro decks. It's just so cheap and makes combat so much more devastating. And in this case, the +1/+1 trample part sticks around. A toughness boost of only 1 won't always help your creatures survive, but I think the trample and roll upside help make up for that. This looks like a trick you'll probably want as many as you can get your hands on in aggressive red decks. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Raging Battle Mouse, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/1 mouse at rare. The second spell you cast each turn costs 1 less to cast. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if 2 or more non-land permanents enter the battlefield under your control this turn, target creature you control gets +1/+1 until end of turn. So this can help you get Celebration going more easily, and that's nice because it has Celebration itself. It also works pretty well with adventures, because some of them had 2 sides that are cheap enough that you can cast them both in the same turn, and this will make that even easier because you are technically casting 2 spells. So it synergizes really well with 2 things this format has going on, and I think that makes up for the fact that it has below race stats, and its own Celebration trigger isn't anything insane, but being really good with adventure and helping you get Celebration going in general makes this a pretty good card, giving it a B. Next up, it's Ratcatcher Trainee, which for 1 generic and a red is a common 2/1 human peasant. As long as it's your turn, it has first strike, and it comes with an adventure called Pest Problem. It's an instant for 2 generic and a red that makes 2 1/1 black rat creature tokens. A 2-mana 2/1 with first strike when it attacks is a great aggressive creature in limited. We've seen it before, and this is a great place to put your roll tokens and things like that. The young hero roll token on this is going to be a pretty big beating. This is another one of these adventures, though, where you're probably more often going to cast the creature before you ever cast the adventure, because if you have this on turn 2, you probably just want to send it out there. Getting full value out of adventures is nice and all, but this is so much better in the early game than it is late that you're just going to cast it. But then it has this late game upside where you can get 2 1/1s and a 2/1 out of a single card. It's another card that can trigger Celebration all on its own with its adventure side. So there's a lot going on here to like in the format, and it's probably just going to be one of the better common 2-drops you can get, especially in red, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Realm Scorcher Hellkite, which for 4 generic and 2 red is a 4/6 dragon at Mythic rare. It has Bargain, which means you can sacrifice an artifact, enchantment, or token as you cast it. It has Flying and Haste. When it enters the battlefield, if it was bargained, you add 4 mana in any combination of colors, and you can pay 1 generic and a red to have it do 1 damage to any target. Well, this is really good. A 6-mana 4/6 with Flying and Haste is probably already pretty playable, and this activated ability is really strong and a crazy place to sink your mana. It can pick off creatures or finish off your opponent quite impressively, and because of Bargain, you have the option of giving up something to get 4 mana right away that, at worst, you can use to do 1 damage twice the turn it comes down. Most of the time, that's going to be a deal worth taking, especially if you have some treasure or food lying around. This thing will basically always give you an immediate impact that is powerful, and then if it's allowed to stick around, the game is just over for your opponent. I'm giving it an A+. Next up, it's Redcap Gutter Dweller, which for 2 generic and 2 red is a 3/3 Goblin Warrior. At rare, it has Menace. When it enters the battlefield, you create 2 1/1 Black Rat creature tokens. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may sacrifice another creature. If you do, put a +1/+1 counter on Redcap Gutter Dweller and exile the top card of your library. You may play that card this turn. 5/5 worth of stats for 4 mana is an amazing starting point. That's already at least a B. And the Gutter Dweller also happens to be able to grow and draw you cards using the expendable bodies he gives you and any other expendable bodies you might have. This can really snowball out of control in a big way. I think this is a bomb. I'm giving it an A. Next up, it's Redcap Thief, which for 2 generic and a red is a 2/3 Goblin Rogue at common. When it enters the battlefield, you create a treasure. This offers some nice fixing and ramp, and can trigger Celebration all on its own. That seems like it's something red decks probably want to do, giving it a C. Next up, it's Rotisserie Elemental, which for 1 red mana is a 1/1 elemental. At rare, it has Menace. When it deals combat damage to a player, put a skewer counter on it. Then you may sacrifice it. If you do, exile the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of skewer counters on Rotisserie Elemental. You may play those cards this turn. If you play this on turn 1, it has an opportunity to do some significant damage and then give itself up with a couple of rotisserie counters on it. That will feel pretty good, but if you play at any point thereafter, it gets a lot less good because it just won't be able to get in. Even if you play it on turn 1 and you get a little greedy and don't sacrifice it in time, it may never get in again, and then you just have this 1 mana 1/1 menace sitting around. It is a good place to put auras and stuff like that, thanks to being cheap and having menace, so it's not bad, but it's also probably not a card that always makes a cut, giving it a C-. Next up, it's Skewer Slinger, which for 1 generic and a red is a 1/3 Dwarf Knight at common with Reach. When it blocks or becomes blocked, Skewer Slinger deals 1 damage to that creature. This makes X1s pretty miserable, as they can neither attack through it or block it effectively. Overall, it is definitely a defensive card more than anything, and that's a little awkward. Like, I'd rather have the usual 2 mana 2/2 with this effect. It's definitely good at blocking X2s, but overall, this is probably a little bit one-dimensional. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Song of Totentons, which for X and a red is a rare sorcery. It creates X 1/1 Black Rat creature tokens. Creatures you control gain haste until end of turn. They can't block, but who cares? This gives all those rats haste, which means they can immediately pressure your opponent. Now, the bad news is this card is bad in the early game, and it isn't going to feel that good if you're really far behind. Basically, it seems really good late, kind of mediocre up until that point, but the upside is very real. It's another card that triggers Celebration all on its own for what it's worth. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Stone Splitter Bolt, which for X and a red is an uncommon instant with Bargain, and it deals X damage to target creature or planeswalker. If this spell was Bargain, it deals twice X damage to that permanent instead. An instant speed X damage spell is always really nice. It scales all game long, it can kill pretty much anything, provided you have the mana. And in this case, if you have Bargain going, that becomes even easier. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Tattered Ratter, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 human peasant at uncommon. Whenever a rat you control becomes blocked, it gets +2/+0 until end of turn. So your rat tokens can often be chump blocked, but Tattered Ratter makes that a heck of a lot harder. It'll make your opponent just have to take damage from attacking rats pretty often, as a 3-power rat can take down most blockers. Still, there are many board states where this is just going to be a 2 mana 2/2, even if you have rats, because there often are situations where your opponent isn't interested in blocking them anyway. Still, I think there are enough rats in this set for this upside to be more significant than maybe it reads at first. Like, there are going to be turns where you have like 2 rats in play, you play Tattered Ratter, suddenly you can attack with both your rats. Like, that's a big shift in the game, and you want to be attacking with your rats as often as you can because they can't block, and this helps you do that. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Torch the Tower, which for 1 red is a common instant. It has Bargain. It deals 2 damage to target creature or planeswalker. If it was bargained, instead it deals 3 damage to that permanent and you scry 1. If a permanent dealt damage by Torch the Tower would die this turn, exile it instead. This is definitely premium removal. It would be without Bargain. With it, it's even better as it can become a 1 mana deal 3. Sure, you have to give something up, and sometimes you won't have something worth giving up, but there are a lot of expendable things in the format. And like I said, this is already good even if you never bargained it at all. It's an amazing common, giving it a B. Next up, it's Twisted Fealty, which for 2 generic and a red is an uncommon sorcery. It says gain control of target creature until end of turn. Untap that creature, it gains haste until end of turn. Create a Wicked Roll token attached up to 1 target creature. This one gives +1/+1, and when the aura is put into the graveyard, your opponent loses 1 life. So there is sacrifice stuff in this set that makes Twisted Fealty pretty nice in decks that are doing that. But I think the fact that this gives you a Wicked Roll token might make it playable even outside of that situation. Once you're getting something of permanent value and a threaten effect, it starts to get a lot more interesting, and that's exactly what we have here. There will definitely be turns where it allows you to do a ton of damage out of nowhere between the Aura token and stealing your opponent's best creature, which was probably also their best blocker. It's probably still going to really shine in black-red, but I think even outside of it, it's probably a C-. If you can find a way to steal an artifact creature and then cast something with Bargain, that's going to be particularly absurd, but there aren't that many artifact creatures in the set. Next up, it's Two-Headed Hunter, which for 4 generic and a red is a 5/4 uncommon giant with Menace. It has an adventure called Twice the Rage. It's an instant. Target creature gains double strike until end of turn. This one means some serious business. The combat trick side will alter combat significantly, usually enough for it to be in your favor, and then in the later part of the game, you get a pretty efficient evasive creature. This is an adventure that will easily deliver 2-for-1s, and then it has the same sort of ridiculous upside any double strike trick has, giving this a B+. Next up, it's Unruly Catapult, which for 2 generic and a red is a 0/4 artifact creature construct at common. It has Defender, it deals 1 damage to each opponent, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you untap it. This isn't quite Thermo Alchemist, but it's doing an okay impression. This will likely be a premier payoff in the blue-red spells deck, and kind of unplayable everywhere else. It can inflict a ton of damage when you have a lot of cheap spells, and an 0/4 body is decently stout. I think this needs a build around grade because it's probably a D in your typical deck that has like 4 cards that will untap it, but a C+ in the blue-red deck. Next up, it's Virtue of Courage, which for 3 generic and 2 red is a mythic rare enchantment. Whenever a source you control deals non-combat damage to an opponent, you may exile that many cards from the top of your library. You may play those cards this turn. The other side is an adventure called Embereth Blaze, which is an instant and it deals 2 damage to any target. The removal side on its own is probably a C. The other side is fairly situational, but there are enough cards in this set that do non-combat damage to an opponent, you know, like the card we just saw that can tap and do 1 damage at a time, that I don't think it's entirely useless either. So basically on one side you have a passable removal spell, and on the other side you have a card that can be a crazy engine, and that's nice late game upside to have on a removal spell that probably already lets you trade 1-for-1 to begin with. So I think the overall package here is a B-. Next up, it's Witch's Mark, which for 1 generic and a red is a common sorcery. You may discard a card if you do, draw 2 cards, create a Wicked Roll token attached up to 1 target creature you control. We've come a long way since Tormenting Voice. Even without the roll token, this card is usually like a D+ or C-, especially if the format has graveyard stuff in a spell deck. Actually adding to the board while digging deeper into your deck is going to feel really nice. You probably don't desperately want more than one of these, although maybe if you're in the spell deck, you go deeper than that. But the first copy seems pretty good. You know, it lets you dig deeper into your deck and adds to the board at the same time. You end up getting a pretty good rate for what you're paying here. I'm giving this a C. And our last red card is Witchstalker Frenzy, which for 3 generic and a red is an uncommon instant. It costs 1 less to cast for each creature that attacked this turn. It deals 5 damage to target creature. Without the cost reduction effect, this would probably be a B-. 4 mana, deal 5 at instant speed is efficient enough to be a great card, and there will be many turns when you can cast this a lot more cheaply. Keep in mind you can attack and then cast this for a reduced cost before your opponent ever gets to blockers. It also counts your opponent's attackers, not just yours, so if they're attacking with a bunch of stuff, maybe you can fire this off and another removal spell. So paying 2 or even 1 for this really isn't that far-fetched, and the baseline is already a really good card, so this is an amazing uncommon. I'm giving it a B+. So that's all the red cards in Wilds of Eldraine. In the next video, I'll take a look at all the green cards. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos in this series and lots of other videos about Magic too, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on the rest of this set review, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.